This is Kofi Time.
When I started the Millennium Development Goals, lots of people dismissed it as a pipe dream. It's a dream, the idea that by 2030 you would eliminate all poverty. But I think it's worth dreaming. Without a dream, you won't go anywhere.
20 years ago, Kofi Annan was awarded, together with the United Nations, the Nobel Peace Prize. Regarded as one of the modern world's icons of diplomacy, what's his legacy today? How can we prepare for tomorrow based on his vision for a better world? Hello, I'm Ahmad Fawzi, and I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Kofi Annan, accompanying him on many missions around the world as one of his spokespersons and communication advisor. Today we will discuss the fight against poverty, an issue that was at the core of Kofi Annan's action as UN Secretary General, and later as the chair of his foundation. In 2005, he wrote, and I quote, "For centuries, poverty has been regarded as a sad but inescapable aspect of the human condition," unquote. But that in our day and age, that view was intellectually and morally indefensible, unquote. Did his work and the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals in particular have a real impact? And 20 years later, where do we stand in the fight against poverty? These are such important questions that we have decided, exceptionally, to dedicate 2 episodes of Kofi Time to ending poverty. For this first episode, I am very pleased to welcome Mark Suzman. Mark, you are the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In this role, you also serve as a member of the Foundation's Board of Trustees. You grew up in South Africa, began your career as a journalist for the Johannesburg Star, and then the Financial Times. You joined the United Nations in the year 2000, where you were part of the effort to implement the Millennium Development Goals under Kofi Annan's leadership. You worked for 6 years at the UN, including as senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary General. You joined the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2007 as Director of Global Development Policy, Advocacy, and Special Initiatives. And prior to becoming CEO, you served as Managing Director of Country Offices, President of Global Policy and Advocacy, and Chief Strategy Officer. Mark, Kofi Annan once said of the Millennium Development Goals that they were a dream worth dreaming. Let's listen to him.
When I started the Millennium Development Goals, lots of people dismissed it as a pipe dream. It's a dream, the idea that by 2030 you would eliminate all poverty. But I think it's worth dreaming. Without a dream, you won't go anywhere.
Mark, my question to you is this. Were the Millennium and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals just dreams?
The Millennium Development Goals were, I think, in many ways the most transformative vision for development that the world has seen since World War II, since the founding of the UN. It was consistent with the overall commitment of the United Nations to eradicate poverty, but what it did is it combined it with real targets. There was an aspiration to eradicate poverty, but the actual goals had concrete, measurable targets with a 2015 that was to eradicate extreme poverty or to reduce extreme poverty by 2/3 by 2015, to reduce child mortality by 2/3, to reduce maternal mortality, to provide progress in gender equality in other areas. And so what that enabled you to do was both to aspire to a broad goal, but then measure very concretely what was happening. And that helped trigger a different kind of both focus on health and development issues by countries themselves, because these were goals in the Millennium Declaration adopted by every member state at the UN in 2000. And it also allowed development partners to coalesce around a common set of frameworks. And that did lead, both directly and indirectly through the catalyzing action from the private sector and civil society and others, to what essentially the first 2 decades of the 21st century saw the greatest improvements in human well-being for the greatest number of people spread across more geographic regions, every geographic region, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, than we had ever seen before in human history. So yes, I believe the MDGs and the Millennium Declaration and that aspiration and dream led to very concrete, measurable improvements in the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world.
So progress was indeed achieved at the time, yet, sadly, COVID-19 seems to have reversed years of progress. At the end of 2020, the number of people living on less than $1.90 a day had increased to almost 750 million. 750 million. In fact, Oxfam reported a few months ago that another 250 million could crash into extreme levels of poverty because of COVID-19, as well as rising global inequality and the shock of food price rises. The organization rejected the notion that governments do not have the means to lift all people out of poverty. They blamed, and I quote here Oxfam, the absence of economic imagination and political will to actually do so, unquote. Do you agree that governments have the means to end poverty, but lack the will to do so?
Well, in the big picture, as I say, the track record of the first 2 decades of the 21st century prove that they do. Even in the very poorest countries, you can make massive progress. Ethiopia was one country that, with 100 million people, met every Millennium Development Goal. But you hit headwinds. Ethiopia is a good example now of a country sadly in the middle of a sort of tragic civil conflict, which has halted progress. But more broadly, as you say, the COVID crisis combined with the attendant fiscal shocks and now the food crisis that has been exacerbated by both climate change and the war in Ukraine has meant the last 2 years, 21 and 22, have been the first 2 years of the 21st century where we have actually seen increases in extreme poverty, increases in global health, increases in child mortality. That momentum has stalled and begun to reverse. And that's why it is more critical than ever that governments do redouble a focus on poverty reduction, on the steps that can be taken to improve health and well-being and gender equality, which are at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals that were implemented in 2015 as the successor to the MDGs. And I believe not only is that more important than ever, but we have tools and pathways that are proven, not just for governments alone, although they have the primary accountability, but working with the private sector and civil society and other partners, philanthropies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It needs to be not just a call to action, but real action needed right now.
You mentioned the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of which you are, of course, CEO. The foundation expressed concern a few months ago that faced with these crises in 2022, some countries were actually considering redirecting aid to immediate humanitarian assistance, such as housing Ukrainian refugees. Bill Gates cautioned that we don't have to accept extreme suffering in one part of the planet to alleviate it in another. So, Mark, how do you see the situation evolving as regards the international community's commitment?
What is important about the current crisis is it cannot be either or. It must be both and. It is imperative that the world does respond to humanitarian crises like the war in Ukraine and support Ukrainian refugees. It is imperative that the world responds to the food security crisis and the very real risk of famine in countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and in the Horn of Africa right now. But these humanitarian support in the short term should not come at the expense of the long-term investments that lead to sustained human development. That is something that Kofi Annan understood very well and stood for in many ways, both as Secretary General and at his time leading the foundation afterwards. Because we saw it in, let me give you two examples. One is the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which in many ways was an entity that Kofi Annan helped found. He was the original patron of it, founded in 2002. And that has arguably now saved more lives, over 50 million lives, than any other comparable effort. And it's crowded in philanthropies, governments, private sector, civil society. And we just had a successful replenishment hosted at the United Nations just a week ago by President Biden of the United States of that same global fund. Now, a replenishment would raise $14.5 billion over the next 3 years, which is very much a legacy of Kofi's to address those longer term issues as well as the shorter term issues. A second area is in the support around food security. Again, Kofi Annan was ahead of his times in commissioning both a major report on agricultural development when he was Secretary General, and after stepping down as Secretary General, took on the role as chair of AGRA, which was the first African-led institution to help support essentially a huge acceleration of agricultural productivity across the continent of Africa. Because what is needed is long-term self-sufficiency, especially in the context of climate change. And that is eminently possible, but currently sub-Saharan Africa has access to fewer inputs of seeds and fertilizer and other tools, has less access to global markets, has less financial support. And that was exactly an area what AGRA sought to address, and which now, again, in the current food crisis, is an opportunity both for African governments, but also the global community to redouble efforts to support both short-term food production, including ensuring there's access to fertilizer and other tools for farmers in the current production cycle, but also significantly increase research and development into areas like drought and flood resilient crops and livestock. And those are, again, examples of both what Kofi stood for and drove while he was Secretary General at the UN and afterwards, but that the world really needs to be able to do right now. Address short-term humanitarian crises, but stay very conscious about the long-term investments that are needed to build the resilience to make sure that future crises are averted.
It can't be either or, as you said. It has to be both. But that sort of implies a new strategy. A new strategy that has to be adopted by governments and the corporate world and civil society. And that leads me to ask you, what would you say is the single most effective action that governments and the international community can take today to help eradicate poverty globally?
There's not a single action so much as a deep focus on what we like to call human development and human capital. Investing in people in the short and long term, because that is both the ultimate focus and goal of the SDGs, which are people and planet, but it's a healthy planet to ensure a healthy and productive life for all people, which is what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stands for. And so these are the investments in basic health, in education, in agricultural productivity, in women and gender equality. And these are overlapping investments. If you invest in the education of a girl, you are investing in the health of that girl as she becomes a young woman and ultimately a mother. She's much more likely to seek health for her child and provide better, more nutritious food and make sure that child gets an education and becomes a more productive member of society. And so you see these linkages across the SDGs, that is, goal 5 and goal 1, and those ones, the gender equality goal and the poverty reduction goal. And so it is those investments in people, which frankly, right now, it sounds obvious, but it's not actually happening. The commitments and investments in health and broader development have actually been declining, partly because of fiscal pressures, partly because of debt pressures, partly, there are a range of reasons why that's happening. But that is the simplest. It's investing in people. And then within that, there's some very concrete tools and techniques, whether it's vaccines, whether it's the Global Fund tools of HIV, antiretrovirals and malaria bed nets, whether it's new educational tools and digital technology and others which have come to the fore. And actually a mild silver lining of COVID has shown us new ways to educate larger numbers of children. at lower cost, and the kind of longer term research and development and innovation that I talked about in agriculture in particular, because agriculture is the core both for food security and self-sufficiency in countries, but it's also, you need to remember that of the very poorest, those numbers you were citing who live on $1.90 a day, 2/3 of those are still rural poor, largely across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and other parts of the world. And it is those rural poor who need and benefit most from those investments in agricultural productivity.
You sound optimistic.
I am optimistic about the possibility and potential of progress if we can get the support and the attention and the resources from governments. That currently is not happening at the scale that is needed. It's there. We see glimpses, we see rhetorical commitments, but we haven't seen the actual resources and the necessary actions to date. It's not at the scale that is needed.
It's a big if, isn't it, Mark? I mean, every time we make some progress, we seem to reverse that with a cycle of crises. Fuel prices going up, and they're going to go up again. The food crisis. I could cite, the pandemic, of course. It's a very big if, and I would like to think if Kofi were with us today, what would he have done? You said he was ahead of his time, and he initiated so many good initiatives like the Global Fund and Agra. What do you think he would have be thinking if he was with us today?
Well, to take one very concrete upcoming context, there is the COP, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, that is about to be hosted by Egypt next month. And that is it's kind of a Kofi Annan type of event, in that it brings together these multiple stakeholders, because he stood for, governments taking the lead, but crowding in private sector, civil society, other partners to address a pressing global challenge. And in this case, the opportunity is to focus hugely on climate adaptation as much as climate mitigation. To date, most of the energy in the previous COPs, and certainly 99% of the resources and commitments, have tended to go towards the reduction of greenhouse gases. That is critical and very important and needs to happen. But again, like the humanitarian crisis we talked about, it cannot be an either or. As we've seen in the current food crisis, it is those most affected by climate change, by the droughts and floods we've seen from Pakistan to the Horn of Africa in just the last 12 months, who contributed least to those greenhouse gases that are causing those fluctuations. That means there's both a moral obligation, but also a practical, need and commitment for a much stronger focus on the adaptation in real time for those populations to help them be more climate resilient. And that is an opportunity for the world to step up both real commitments and real investment. At the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I will be attending COP, and we will be making some major commitments in that space because we see that necessity. But to be blunt, again, I see lots of talk and not a huge amount of action in terms of the real investments at this stage. But this is the kind of thing that Kofi would call out and say, this is both, a moral injustice, but also a necessary step for a fair and equal world to actually have those investments be made by the rich worlds as well as across the global south, because this is a shared agenda to boost long-term global resilience and prosperity.
Indeed. Well said. May I conclude by asking you a question about your own personal interaction with Kofi Annan? You worked closely with him. What impressed you most about his approach to the enormous challenges he faced as Secretary General? Was there a particular trait in his personality that struck you most?
So I think what struck me most, and it's something that I've tried to learn from and, emulate to some degree, although it's very challenging to emulate someone as universally competent as Kofi Annan was, was the combination of keeping a broad vision and a set of goals and objectives firmly in mind, whether it was around peace and conflict and peace building, whether it was the Millennium Development Goals, whether it was the agricultural development that he devoted a lot of his post-UN career. It would always keep focused on the long-term goal, but deal with whatever the immediate problems and issues and people were in a very calm, deliberate, forthright, and focused manner. That sounds, prosaic, but actually I think it's deeply profound in terms of ability. It's a very rare ability to do that. I never saw him lose his temper, even despite, massive provocations from, for example, when we were having a showdown, if you want to call it an example, with Ambassador John Bolton of the US, who in 2005 at the World Summit wanted to remove all references to the Millennium Development Goals in the declaration that was being prepared for that UN General Assembly. And that was a fraught and very confrontational episode. It could have been deeply damaging to the entire development agenda. And instead, what Kofi Annan was able to do was work directly with the US government, in this case, then the Secretary of State, Condi Rice, and actually got US support and endorsement. And in that 2005 UN General Assembly is when the then President George W. Bush, for the first time, had the United States formally endorse the Millennium Development Goals in his speech at the UN General Assembly. So I use that as a concrete example of how you manage through a very confrontational, short-term set of exchanges with, in this case, a very belligerent ambassador who was asking for things that, frankly, would have been deeply destructive to the global enterprise, but then managing to a successful outcome where you actually had the world more united than ever. And in retrospect, it really was after that 2005 summit that you had true momentum on the MDGs. It was that decade from 2005 to 2015 where we saw the most progress. The 2000 to 2005, we were still building those coalitions, building those structures. People were still tentative. Is this a framework we should get behind? The World Bank wasn't initially supportive of it. Others weren't initially supportive of it. By that time, everyone came together and said, this truly is a shared global endeavor and a set of goals. And that's, for me, an example of the kind of leadership and commitment and the combination of both long-term vision and short-term, just political aptitude, patience, and personal resilience that was just extraordinary, inspirational for me as a young UN staffer.
Universally competent, indeed. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your thoughts and these stories with us and helping us understand better how Kofi Annan tried to advance the fight against poverty and what remains to be done to achieve this dream. Thank you, Mark Suzman, CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Kofi Time. Wherever you are, please share the values that Kofi Annan represented that you think are relevant today using #Kofi Time. Kofi Time is brought to you by the Kofi Annan Foundation and the United Nations Information Service in Geneva. Produced by Gianluca Alaria. Join me again for the next episode of Kofi Time.